The morning started the way most mornings did in the small town of Kensington Gate, quietly, with the smell of bread from the corner bakery floating through the streets and pigeons fighting over crumbs near the iron fence of the royal grounds. It was the kind of morning that made people feel like nothing unusual could ever happen here. Like the world was too sleepy and too comfortable for anything dramatic. Amara did not feel that way. She was 11 years old, with braids her mother had plaited tight the night before, a school backpack that was too heavy for her small frame, and eyes that noticed things. That was the thing about Amara, she noticed things that other people walked right past. She noticed when the flower seller on the corner switched from yellow tulips to red ones without being asked. She noticed when the old man on the bench fed the pigeons from his left hand instead of his right, which meant his arthritis was acting up again. She noticed patterns. She noticed when something broke the pattern. She was walking to school that morning, taking her usual route along the wide stone pavement that ran beside the outer fence of the palace grounds. It was a longer way around than cutting through the market lane, but she liked it. She liked seeing the guards in their uniforms, standing straight and serious like they had been carved from the same stone as the fence itself. She liked the way the flag above the East Tower moved in the wind. She liked feeling like she was walking beside something important. It was 7:43 in the morning. She knew because she had checked her watch, the purple one with the cracked plastic strap her father had given her before he moved to Leeds, the one she refused to replace even though it pinched her wrist sometimes. The van was parked on Aldermore Street, which ran parallel to the back service road of the palace grounds. It was a white van, plain and wide, the kind that could belong to anyone: a plumber, a delivery company, a catering service. There was nothing painted on its side. No logo. No company name. No license plate that she could see from where she stood, because the back of the van was facing her and the plate was caked in something dark, like mud or paint, deliberately smeared so the numbers were impossible to read. She stopped walking. Most people would have kept going. Most people would have told themselves it was nothing, that white vans were everywhere, that dirty license plates were common in winter, that they had somewhere to be. Amara stood there for 12 seconds, she counted, staring at the van and letting the wrongness of it settle into her. The van had been there yesterday morning too. She remembered it because she had noticed it in the same way she noticed the flower seller's tulips, just a small detail that registered in the back of her mind without demanding attention. But now it was the second morning in a row. Same spot. Same position. Nose into the curb so the back faced the service gate. Engine off. No movement inside that she could see through the windshield, but the windshield was fogged in a way that meant someone had been breathing in there recently. She looked at the palace fence. The service gate was 30 meters away. On the other side of that gate was a loading area, and, beyond that, the palace kitchens, and, beyond that, everything. Amara was not dramatic by nature. She was practical. She had been raised by a mother who said things like feelings are fine but evidence is better and don't cause a fuss unless there's something to fuss about. She stood there and went through the checklist in her head. White van, no plates, same spot 2 days running, fogged windows, parked facing the service entrance of a royal palace, on a street with no shops or residents who might receive deliveries. That was enough. She walked to the main gate, which was 200 meters further along the fence, where 2 guards stood in their formal posts. She had walked past them dozens of times and they had never looked at her directly, the way that very important-looking guards often don't look at ordinary people. They looked past you, or through you, or at a fixed point somewhere above your head that apparently contained all the information they needed. She stopped in front of the one on the left. He was tall and young, maybe 25, with a serious face and very clean boots. "Excuse me," she said. He didn't look at her. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time, because she had also been raised by a mother who said if someone ignores you the first time, they heard you, try again. He looked down. The adjustment of his chin was almost imperceptible, but she caught it. "I need to tell you something about a van," she said. "On Aldermore Street. I think something might be wrong." His expression didn't change. But his eyes did, just slightly. They sharpened in a way that told her he was actually listening even though the rest of him had not moved a single millimeter. "What van?" he said. Not a question. A direction. White. Parked facing the service gate at the back. No plates I can read, they're covered in something dark. It was there yesterday morning too, same spot, same position. The windows are fogged from inside. He looked at her for a long moment. She stood still and let him look. She did not fidget or look away, because she had decided when she was 7 years old that fidgeting made adults take you less seriously, and she had worked very hard to stop doing it. "How old are you?" he said. 11. That doesn't change what the van looks like. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to respect. "Stay here," he said. His name was Officer Callum Reed. He would not know until much later that those 2 words he said to a small girl with braids and a cracked purple watch, "Stay here," would turn out to be the hinge point of the most significant security event at the palace in 11 years. He walked to the small security post to the right of the gate, spoke into a radio, and, within 4 minutes 2 plainclothes officers were moving down the outer street toward Aldermore, moving the way people move when they don't want to look like they're moving toward anything. Amara stayed where she told. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the flag on the east tower. It moved slowly in a wind she couldn't feel from where she stood. She was going to be late to school. She decided that was acceptable. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known from where she stood with her heavy backpack and her 2 tight braids, was that inside that white van, folded into the space behind the front seats in a way that no adult body should fold, were 2 men who had been watching the palace service gate for 36 hours. And, in the back of the van, under a tarpaulin that smelled of oil and something else, something sharper and chemical, were things that made the plainclothes officers go very still when they lifted the edge of that tarpaulin and looked underneath. Callum Reed came back to the gate 14 minutes after he had left. His face was still serious, but it was a different kind of serious now, not guard at his post serious, but the kind that meant something had actually happened. "I need you to come inside," he said. Amara looked at the open gate. She had never been on the other side of it before. From the street it had always looked like a wall between one world and another. "Is it bad?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "We're going to need a statement from you. Your name, what you saw, when you saw it." "My name is Amara," she said. "Amara Osei. And I can tell you exactly what I saw." She walked through the gate. Behind her, on Aldermore Street, she could hear more vehicles arriving. Sirens that hadn't been switched on yet, but would be soon, that particular heavy rumble of engines that meant authority was gathering in numbers. Inside the palace grounds it smelled different than she expected. She had imagined something grand and floral, something that matched the weight and age of the stone buildings. Instead it smelled like cut grass and cold morning air and, faintly, from somewhere distant, coffee. The path was smooth and wide and lined with dark gravel on either side. 2 more officers were walking toward them from the direction of a low stone building near the main residence. She was taken to a warm room with a table and chairs and a cup of hot chocolate that appeared in front of her before she had even finished spelling out her name for the officer with the notebook. The hot chocolate was very good. She held the cup in both hands and told them everything, the pattern of the mornings, the details of the van, the specific things that had made her stop instead of keep walking. When she described covering the license plates with dark smeared material, the officer with the notebook looked up from his writing and held her gaze for a moment. "You noticed the plates were deliberately obscured," he said. "Yes. And you registered that as significant." "It's the kind of thing that's only done on purpose," she said. "Plates don't get that dirty from mud. Not evenly like that." It looked applied. The officer set his pen down and looked at her the way adults very rarely looked at 11-year-olds, like he was seeing someone actually present in the room, not just a child to be managed gently and sent home. Outside the warm room, in corridors she couldn't see and offices several floors above her, the morning was becoming something else entirely. Calls were being made. A network of security personnel was being activated. 2 men were being removed from a white van on Aldermore Street, and the contents of that van were being photographed and catalogued by people in protective gear whose faces showed nothing because they were trained to show nothing, even when what they were looking at turned every assumption about the morning's routine inside out. The palace had received threats before. Every institution of that size, that visibility, that symbolic weight had received threats. There were protocols for threats. But, a plan of the kind that was unfolding on Aldermore Street, coordinated, patient, positioned over multiple days directly adjacent to a service gate used by vehicles with known access, that was a different category. That was someone who had done serious preparation. Amara finished her hot chocolate. She asked if she could call her mother. They brought her a phone immediately, and she dialed her mother's number and said, "Mom, I'm going to be late to school. I'm at the palace. I'll explain when I get home." There was a silence on the other end that contained about 14 different questions, and then her mother said, "Are you safe?" And she said yes, and her mother said, "Then I'll be at the school gate at 2:30, in the voice she used when she was putting all her feelings in a box to open later. Amara handed the phone back and looked at the officer with the notebook. "What happens now?" she said. "We'd like your parents to come in," he said. "And there are some people who will want to speak with you." "Senior people." "Senior like in charge of security?" "Senior like that, yes." She nodded. Outside the window she could see a corner of the grounds, a wide lawn, impossibly green for February, and, beyond it, the east wing of the main building, its windows reflecting the gray winter sky. Somewhere behind those windows people were working, living, moving through their morning inside the weight of a history so old it had its own gravity. And a girl with braids and a cracked purple watch had just changed the shape of that morning entirely. She sat straight in her chair and waited for the senior people to arrive, and she was not frightened, and she was not overwhelmed, and she was only very slightly late to school. Well, more than very slightly. But she had decided that was acceptable too. The door opened, and the shape of the day shifted again, and Amara Ose looked up and was ready for whatever walked through it. The woman who walked through the door was not what Amara expected. She had imagined someone military, pressed and formal, all rank and angles. Instead there was a woman of about 50 in a plain dark blazer and trousers, with reading glasses pushed up on her head like they had been forgotten there, and the careful, measuring look of someone who had spent a long career figuring out what people were not saying. Her name was Director Sylvia Marsh, and she was the head of the Royal Protection Coordination Unit, a department that most people had never heard of and that Sylvia preferred to keep it that way. She had a team of 47 people, a budget that did not appear in any public document, and a particular allergy to surprises. The van on Aldermore Street was a surprise, and surprises of that scale made her feel something in the back of her jaw that was not quite pain but was adjacent to it. She sat across from Amara, put a tablet face down on the table, and folded her hands on top of it. "Tell me about yesterday morning," she said. "Not what you told the officers. Tell me the way you would tell a friend. Start from when you first saw it." Amara looked at her for a moment. She appreciated the distinction, not the official version, the human version. She started talking. She told Sylvia about the route she took every morning along the palace fence. She explained that she took it not because it was fast but because she liked it, liked the weight of the place, liked the way it felt like walking next to something that had been standing long before she was born and would stand long after. She told her about noticing the van the first morning, a low-level notice, the kind that doesn't ring an alarm but leaves a smudge in your memory. And she told her about the second morning, about stopping, about counting the seconds while she processed the pattern against the smudge. Sylvia listened without writing anything down. That, Amara noted, was interesting. She was being read, not recorded. "You said you counted," Sylvia said. "You stood there for 12 seconds. "Yes." "Why did you count?" Amara thought about it. "Because I didn't want to be wrong," she said. "If I was going to tell someone, I wanted to be sure I'd actually stopped and looked properly, not just reacted. Counting felt like proof that I'd done it right." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the pale winter sun had risen enough to hit the tops of the trees at the far edge of the lawn, and the upper branches were briefly gold. "Amara," she said. "What's in the van is being processed by our team right now. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that what you noticed and, specifically the timing of it, matters very much. The materials we've found suggest a plan that was 72 hours from its intended execution window. Amara did the math. 3 days. Whatever was supposed to happen was 3 days away. Would someone else have noticed? She said. Our external camera on that side of Aldermore has been offline for 4 days for scheduled maintenance, Sylvia said. The service gate guard sightline doesn't include that stretch of curb. The street has no residential foot traffic before 8 in the morning. She paused. You take an unusual route to an unusual place at an unusual time because you like the way it feels. She didn't say anything else after that. She didn't need to. The shape of what she wasn't saying was clear enough. Amara sat with it. The weight of it was odd, not heavy exactly, but dense, like something that took up more space than its size should allow. My mom is coming at 3:30, she said. We'll have someone meet her at the gate, Sylvia said. A man knocked and entered without waiting, handed Sylvia a single printed sheet, and left. She read it in about 8 seconds, and something crossed her face, not alarm, but the recalibration of a person who has received a fact that changes the size of a problem. Excuse me for a moment, she said, and left the room. Amara sat alone. She looked at the tablet on the table, still face down. She looked at the window. She looked at the door. She thought about what 72 hours meant, not abstractly, but specifically, in terms of what 72 hours from now would look like in this building, in this courtyard, in the offices she could feel humming above her. What the morning would have looked like if she had taken the market lane instead of the long way around. She thought about the people who lived here. Not as symbols or history, just as people who woke up in the morning and had coffee and walked down corridors and looked out windows at that impossibly green lawn. People who had not known, 3 hours ago, that a white van had been sitting 30 meters from their service gate for 2 days. The door opened again and, this time it was Callum Reed, Officer Reed, the guard she had first spoken to. He was out of his formal post uniform now, in a different jacket, and, without the rigid ceremony of the gate he looked younger and, also more real. Thought you might want company, he said. She did, actually. Yes. He sat in the chair Sylvia had vacated and put his elbows on the table and looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided that formality was not useful right now. You were right not to second-guess yourself, he said. I almost did, she said. I stood there and I thought, it's probably nothing, it's just a van, I'll be late, I should keep going. But you didn't. No. Why? She thought about it the way she thought about most things, fully, not reaching for the quick answer. Because I decided a long time ago that if I see something that looks wrong and I walk past it because I don't want to make a fuss and it turns out it was wrong, I won't be able to live with that. I won't be able to live with having been the person who kept walking. Callum Reed looked at her for a moment. He was thinking about the camera that had been offline. He was thinking about the sightline of the service gate guard. He was a trained security officer with 3 years at this post and a full understanding of the perimeter protocols, and he had walked past Aldermore Street twice in the past week during perimeter checks and had not stopped. He didn't say any of that. He said, "That's a brave way to be in the world." "It doesn't feel brave," she said. "It just feels like the only way that makes sense." Outside, the investigation was expanding in the way these things expand, in concentric rings, each one wider and more complicated than the last. The 2 men from the van had been transported to a secure holding facility and were being processed under anti-terrorism protocols. Their documentation was being run through international databases. The materials from the back of the van, the tarpaulin, the items beneath it, the equipment along the side panel were being examined by a specialist team whose reports would take hours to complete but whose preliminary findings had already caused Sylvia Marsh to make a call to a number she kept in her phone under a codename and dialed only 4 times in her career. This was the 5th time. There were things Amara would never know about what had been in that van. Some of them were kept from her because she was a child and the details were not appropriate. Some of them were kept from her because they were classified at levels that most adults would never access. And some of them were kept from her simply because the people around her understood, instinctively and kindly, that knowing everything would change the texture of what she had done would make it feel heavier and more frightening than it needed to feel for an 11-year-old who had simply decided not to walk past something wrong. What she did know, what was gently and carefully communicated to her across the course of the morning, was that what she had done was real, and it mattered, and the people in this building were aware of it. Her mother arrived at 2:37, which was before 3:30, because Grace O'Say had spent the morning trying very hard not to count minutes and had eventually given up and arrived early. She was brought in through the main gate by a palace liaison officer who told her very little but, in a way that was clearly designed to be reassuring, and who guided her to the warm room with the table where Amara was sitting with a second hot chocolate and a book that someone had found for her from somewhere, a library somewhere inside the palace, apparently, which was the kind of detail that Amara stored away to think about later. Grace O'Say walked in and looked at her daughter the way mothers look at children they have been worried about, a full-body look, checking for damage, finding none, recalibrating from worry to something more complicated. "You're all right," she said. "I'm all right," Amara said. Grace sat down and reached across the table and took her daughter's hand and held it tightly for a moment without saying anything. Then, she looked at the room, the good chairs, the quiet hum of the building around them, the cup of hot chocolate. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. Amara told her. All of it, in the same careful order she had told it to the officers, to Callan Reid, to Sylvia Marsh. Her mother listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, letting each piece of information land before reaching for the next one. When Amara finished, Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, she said, "You remembered it from yesterday." "Yes. You kept it." "I didn't think it was important yesterday. Just a notice. It became important the second morning." Grace looked at her daughter's face. Amara had her father's eyes, big and watchful and slightly too serious for an 11-year-old's face, the kind of eyes that made people feel seen whether they wanted to be or not. Those eyes had picked up something a camera had missed and a trained guard had not caught and a whole perimeter protocol had not flagged. "I'm proud of you," Grace said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a flat, warm, certain statement. "I was just going to school," Amara said. "You were going to school and you were paying attention," Grace said. "Most people stop paying attention. They get comfortable and the world becomes wallpaper and they stop seeing what's actually there. You didn't stop." Amara thought about that. The world as wallpaper. She looked at the window, at the patch of lawn and the tree line and the pale February sky that was now brightening toward something that might, eventually, become afternoon. Sylvia Marsh came back into the room. She looked at Grace O'Say with the careful professional warmth of someone who has delivered many different kinds of news in many different kinds of rooms, and she sat down and said, "Mrs. O'Say, I want to explain what we know so far, and what this means, and what we would like to ask of your family going forward." Grace listened. Amara already knew most of it. She looked at the book on the table, a collection of nature essays, someone's personal copy, because there was a small annotation in pencil in the margin of the first page. She wondered who had loaned it without thinking, just grabbed something off a shelf to give a child something to hold. She liked that. The casualness of it. The humanness. Outside, in a building whose walls held centuries of ceremony and gravity, and in corridors that had absorbed more history than most cities, people were doing difficult and serious work. They would continue doing it for many hours, and the full shape of what had been prevented would take weeks to become clear, and some of it would never become clear at all. But, in this room, with the winter light coming through the window and a second cup of hot chocolate going slightly cold and a mother holding a daughter's hand and a pencil annotation in the margin of a borrowed book, something had already settled. Something had been stopped. That was real. That had happened. And it had happened because an 11-year-old girl decided, for 12 counted seconds, not to keep walking. Sylvia finished speaking. Grace asked several sharp, practical questions that made Sylvia's expression shift into the kind of respect usually reserved for people with significant clearance. Amara added 2 clarifications when she felt the account had missed a detail. The afternoon continued. And, somewhere across the city, in a secure facility with no windows, 2 men sat in rooms and faced the beginning of a very long process of answering questions about a white van with covered plates and a 72-hour plan that had not arrived at its intended destination. Because a girl with braids had taken the long way to school. Because she liked the way the palace fence felt when she walked beside it. Because she had decided, at age 7, to stop fidgeting. Because she had counted to 12 and not walked away. 3 weeks passed before anyone from the palace contacted them again, and, in those 3 weeks, the world moved forward the way it always does, with complete indifference to the things that had almost happened inside it. Amara went back to school the following morning. She had missed an entire day of classes, and her teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, had sent a note home asking for a written explanation, because Mrs. Pemberton was a thorough woman who believed that unexplained absences opened small cracks in the structure of things. Amara wrote 2 sentences. I was helping with a security matter near the palace. I was not in trouble. She gave it to her mother to countersign, and her mother signed it without reading it, which was the only time in Amara's memory that her mother had done that, and which told her more about how her mother felt about those 2 days than any conversation they had managed to have. School was strange after that. Not because anyone knew what had happened, they didn't, and Amara had no intention of telling them, but because she felt it. The knowledge of it sat in her like a stone at the bottom of a river, not visible from the surface but changing the way the water moved above it. She sat in her classes and she listened and she answered questions and she ate lunch with her friends Priya and Ren, who were talking about a television series she hadn't watched, and she was present for all of it, but she was also somehow very aware of the specific coordinates of her own body in the room, the way you become aware of a healed bruise, not painful, just there. Ren noticed something was different. Ren always noticed because Ren was the kind of person who collected other people's silences and held on to them until they were ready to become conversations. She sat next to Amara at lunch on the 3rd day back and said, "You've got something in you," which was Ren's specific way of saying she knew but wasn't pushing. "I do," Amara said. "Big?" "Yes." "Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right," Amara said, and she meant it in a way she couldn't fully explain, because it wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like having found out something about yourself that you had suspected but never confirmed. She ate the rest of her lunch in a comfortable silence and Ren let her, because that was what Ren was for. The weeks moved. Amara read the news each morning on her mother's phone, the way she had started doing after the van, looking for any trace of it: an arrest report, a security briefing, a vague reference to a foiled incident. There was nothing. The silence of it was not surprising. She understood now, in a way she hadn't before, that the most significant things were often the quietest. The news was full of what had happened, it was never full of what hadn't. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day, bins out on the pavement, slight rain, Amara's maths homework on the kitchen table waiting to be finished. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, the kind of thick that meant quality paper inside, and it was addressed in a font that looked almost handwritten but was too precise. Grace brought it inside from the postbox and stood in the kitchen holding it like it had said something to her. "Amara," she called. Amara came down from her room. She looked at the envelope. She read the small embossed crest in the upper left corner. She sat down at the kitchen table, on top of her unfinished maths homework, and opened it. The letter was formal in its language, precise in its phrasing, and warm in the exact careful way that official correspondence manages to be warm when the people behind it genuinely mean it. It began with an acknowledgement of what Amara had done, described in terms that were general enough to reveal nothing sensitive but specific enough that she felt seen inside the formality of it. It thanked her for her attentiveness, her judgment, and her courage in approaching the gate guard rather than continuing with her morning. And then, it invited her and her mother, to visit the palace for a private meeting at a date and time to be confirmed, at which certain individuals would wish to express their personal gratitude. Amara read it twice. She set it on the table. She looked at her mother. Grace looked at the letter and then at her daughter and then at the ceiling, briefly, the way she looked at the ceiling when she was arranging her feelings into a manageable order. "Right," Grace said. "Right," Amara agreed. They confirmed the date the next morning. They went 3 Saturdays later, in February, when the cold was still sitting hard on the city and the streets outside the palace fence were quiet in the way they get on winter weekend mornings. Grace wore the blue coat she kept for occasions. Amara wore her good jumper and her cleanest trainers and her hair in the same braids, because the braids were who she was and she was not going to be someone different just because the location was unusual. They were met at the main gate by the same palace liaison officer who had met Grace 3 weeks earlier, and he brought them through the grounds on a route that took them past the wide lawn Amara had seen from the window of the warm room, greener, even in February, than anything green had a right to be, and into the main building through a side entrance with high ceilings and dark wood paneling and a smell of wood polish and something older underneath it. Callum Reed was waiting for them in the entrance hall. Out of his formal gate uniform, in a jacket that looked like he had thought carefully about it, he looked like a person rather than a post, and he greeted Amara with the corner of the mouth thing that she recognized from the gate, not quite a smile, the thing adjacent to respect. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "You look like you're prepared for whatever this is." "I prepared to be myself," she said. "Which I already know how to do." He laughed, a full laugh this time, not controlled, and Grace O'Shea smiled the smile she used when her daughter did something she planned to think about for a long time. They were taken through corridors that were longer than they appeared to be, past paintings and framed documents and windows that looked out onto different sections of the grounds from different angles, and then into a room that was neither grand nor intimidating, a sitting room, really, with good chairs and a low table and a window overlooking a small formal garden where the hedges were clipped into geometric shapes that were somehow both severe and pleasant. Sylvia Marsh was there, standing near the window. She nodded at Amara when she entered. Amara nodded back. There was an understanding between them that had formed in the warm room 3 weeks ago, in the specific way that understanding sometimes forms between people of very different ages who have recognized something shared in the way the other sees the world. There were 2 other people in the room. Amara knew who they were before anyone introduced them, because she recognized them the way anyone in the country would recognize them, from photographs and news footage and the specific particular weight that certain people carry into a room, a weight made of history and expectation and the sheer accumulated reality of what they represent. She did not stare. She had decided on the drive over that she would not stare, because staring was a kind of hollowing out of a person. It replaced them with the symbol of themselves, and whatever else these people were, they were also people, and she intended to meet them as people. They shook her hand. One of them said her name, Amara, the way you say a name when you have read it in a document and decided to remember it. The other sat across from her and looked at her with direct and genuine attention and said, "We've been told you're remarkable at noticing patterns. Tell us about that. How did you learn to look the way you look?" And Amara, who had been raised by a woman who said feelings are fine but evidence is better, and who had spent 11 years building a method of seeing out of curiosity and patience and a refusal to let the world become wallpaper, opened her mouth and began to explain. She told them about the flower cellar and the tulips. About the old man with the pigeons and which hand he fed them from. About the way she had realized, quite young, that most people looked at the center of things and missed the edges, and she had decided deliberately to look at the edges. About the 7-year-old decision to stop fidgeting because she wanted people to take her seriously. About the cracked purple watch and why she wouldn't replace it. About walking the long way to school because the fence made her feel like she was walking next to something that had survived. The room listened. Not politely, actually. The particular quality of attention in that room was different from most rooms Amara had been in. These were people for whom the performance of listening was a professional tool, who had spent their lives in situations where listening meant something, and they brought the full instrument of it to a girl in a good jumper telling them about a flower cellar and an old man and a Tuesday morning pattern. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "You know," one of them said, "there are people who are trained for years to notice what you noticed that morning." And quite a few of them would have walked past. "I almost walked past," Amara said. "But you counted." "Yes." "Why 12? She thought about it. "I don't know," she said. "It was the number it took. I think your brain knows when it's finished looking if you give it time." The other person across from her smiled, not the public smile, not the photograph smile, but a smaller private one that belonged entirely to the room. "We'd like to give you something," Sylvia said from the window. "A formal recognition. You'll receive a letter from the Lord Chamberlain's office with the details. It's not public, that's your choice, and we'll discuss it with your mother. But we want it to be real." Grace Osei, who had been sitting beside her daughter with her hands folded in her lap and her back perfectly straight and her face composed with the magnificent control of a woman who was feeling very many things and had placed them all carefully in a box, reached over and touched Amara's arm. Amara looked at her mother. Grace was looking at the window. The small formal garden outside was gray in the February light, the geometric hedges bare at their tips. "You have questions," said the person across from Amara. "Not a question." "One," Amara said. "Ask." "The people in the van," she said. "Are they going to face proper consequences?" "Not as a political thing. Just properly. The full weight of it." The room was still. "Yes," Sylvia said. "The process is full and ongoing and the evidence is extensive." "Yes." Amara nodded. "Good," she said. "That matters to me." "I know," Sylvia said. "That's why I answered." They had tea. Real tea, not from a bag, and small sandwiches on a plate that were perfectly made and slightly too elegant to eat without thinking about it, and Amara ate them without thinking about it because she had been raised to eat what was offered without performing self-consciousness, and Grace ate one with deliberate dignity, and Callum Reed had two with the straightforward appetite of a man who had been standing at a gate since 6 in the morning. The conversation moved. It covered things Amara would not repeat outside the room, not because she was told not to, but because they felt like things that belonged there. They talked about the gaps in security that a route like hers could illuminate. They talked carefully, usefully, about what training for attentiveness might look like if it were taught rather than discovered. Sylvia took notes in a small leather notebook. Amara noticed that her handwriting was very fast and slightly slanted, which meant she had a fast mind and wrote to keep pace with it. They were there for 2 hours. When they left, through the same side entrance, past the same high ceilings and wood paneling, out into the cold February air and the impossibly green lawn, Amara carried the shape of the morning inside her with the specific density of something she knew she would not fully understand for years yet. She knew that the things that had been said in that room, and the way they had been said, were laying down something in her, not pride exactly, but something closer to a confirmed sense of direction. She knew what she was good at. She knew it had mattered. She knew that the way she moved through the world attentively, patiently, without letting it become wallpaper, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, a rather large thing. It had just been a quiet large thing, which was the best kind. Grace said nothing until they were through the main gate and onto the pavement outside, where the city resumed its ordinary Saturday morning business, a man walking a dog, a cyclist, a bus going past with its windows fogged from the inside. "Then," she said, "your father is going to hear about this." "You'll tell him?" "I won't have to," Grace said. "You will. This weekend. You'll call him." Amara thought about calling her father. He would be in Leeds, probably in the kitchen he called small and, she remembered as cozy, probably with coffee going. He would answer on the second ring the way he always did, like he had been waiting and was trying not to show it. "He'll be proud," Amara said. "He'll be undone," Grace said. "There's a difference." They walked to the bus stop and waited in the cold and the bus came and they sat on the upper deck because Grace knew Amara still liked the upper deck even though she was too old to admit to liking the upper deck, and the bus moved through the streets of the city and out of the ceremonial district and back into the ordinary grid of roads and shops and lives. Amara looked out the window at the city moving past. The edges of things. The spaces between. The patterns that were always there if you chose to look at them rather than through them. Somewhere in a secure facility without windows, two men were moving through the long and formal machinery of consequence. Somewhere in a palace with an impossibly green lawn, notes were being written in fast slanted handwriting. Somewhere in Leeds, a man who answered on the second ring did not yet know that his daughter had walked through a gate that changed the shape of a morning, and through a room that held the weight of centuries, and through the whole experience with her braids tight and her trainers clean and her cracked purple watch on her wrist. He would find out on Saturday. He would be, as Grace said, undone. The bus moved through the city. Amara watched the edges. She was already looking at the next pattern, the way she always was, the way she always would be, not because anyone had asked her to, not because anyone had trained her, but because she had decided, very young and very firmly, that the world was worth the trouble of being seen clearly. And she had never once decided differently.